Rasanath, hello.
Hey.
So today we are talking about one of, I think, the most important topics that we could possibly talk about, and also one of the most uncomfortable topics to talk about, and that is shame. You and I think we had talked about this about a year ago, that we were wanting to record a podcast together about this topic. And so it's really been in my mind since then, in the back of my mind. And then it came to the front of my mind last week when I myself had a very personal, visceral experience of shame. And I thought, I want to talk about this with Rasanath, and we should do a podcast with it. And so that is how today came to be. And this experience of shame was actually not that out of the ordinary. It was something that I experienced very often, but it was the intensity that really struck me. And so maybe we could chat a little bit about that experience, talk about shame more generally, and then also talk about the original topic for the podcast, which was carrying your shame and why that's so important for us to actually make progress with our own egos.
Yeah, this is a topic I would say that has over time become very dear to my heart, and the reason why I say that is I've begun to recognize there is no real getting away from this emotion, and so understanding it, understanding what it's really pointing towards, and learning how to embrace that journey has become so much of such a big part of my own life, and my spiritual journey as well. So this is a very dear topic.
Excellent. And as you shared that, I was just thinking, even to be able to use the word shame to identify the emotion itself, that's a huge step, and one that I don't think I took until maybe 2 years ago, 3 years ago. Like, that is a big word, and it's one that we're highly conditioned not to use and not to talk about. And so just to be able to say, I'm having an experience of shame and it feels like crap, that is a big step.
Some of these complex emotions have these multiple dimensions, right? Where there's shame about having shame. and so then where do you even start? Because as you said, it's hard to even talk about this emotion, because we do hear messages about, oh, you shouldn't feel that way, or you shouldn't have that emotion, or as men, especially with male psychology, for us, we don't so easily talk about this emotion because there is shame about talking about this emotion as well. It's very, very complex, and so we have to find a starting point, which in itself can be pretty challenging.
Great. Well, I think that's a perfect segue for me to share now my story of last week. And it was just a very normal weekday. I had a couple of coaching sessions scheduled for the morning, and all of my clients just coincidentally had canceled or rescheduled their sessions that day. And so all of a sudden I found myself with this block of time that was previously going to be productive because I was going to have client coaching calls. Now it was just wide open. And so, being the productive person that I am, I got excited about being able to repurpose that time and do some writing and work on some other stuff that had been, on the big to-do list. But the morning got off to kind of a slow start, and I had to do some stuff with my son. I found myself reading a little social media and going down the hole of various articles that are not really relevant for me in any real way. And by like noon, 1 o'clock, I hadn't done anything that I had been excited to actually tackle. And so I just started feeling bad about myself. It started with a little tightness in my chest, a little feeling of discomfort in my head. And I was just like, I am not being productive. And so it moved from this very quickly and very silently. It moved from this kind of taking inventory of what had happened that morning to this very intensive experience of like, I suck and I'm not productive and I'm not a good member of society. And I started thinking about our team and how hard you guys are all working and how many client sessions you have all been doing recently. And I was feeling like, I'm not really earning my piece here and I'm not enough. And that created a very intense spiral of then not being able to be productive because I was feeling the shame. So the lack of productivity led to the shame, and then the shame led to even less productivity. And it was just a pretty nasty spiral down.
Wow. Wow. Um, that's intense. I can completely relate to that. And one of the things that I was sharing with you before we started recording our podcast for this time is feeling perpetually stuck in shame. What I'm recognizing in my life now, more and more, is that shame is not an emotion that I see at some point in time where I don't feel productive. I'm actually perpetually feeling shame all the time, and many times productivity has become a way to cope with my own sense of shame, which which is, I'm waking up to the fact that this is where and this is where a lot of my drives, quote unquote, are actually coming from. Where when I truly analyze my entire life, and I was thinking about it today morning as I woke up, the stories that I manufactured, the images that I created for myself, the pursuits that I had, were all born out of a sense that I'm not enough. Now, interestingly, there is also this drive to maximize my own potential, which when we really think about it or speak about it that way, it has a very noble drive to it. I have been given all of these gifts, and I want to see it. I want to see it manifest to its maximum, and that's a very genuine, legitimate desire. Where it becomes really tricky is I don't know if the drive is actually maximizing my potential, or it's preventing me from feeling the shame of not living up to it. And those are two very different drives, but many times very confusing because one feels like the other. And it takes some subtlety to really understand what the difference between the two is. All that to say that I am finding myself more and more looking at and understanding that a lot of drives in my own life have actually come from a place of predominantly coping with my own shame. So I live there perpetually. And it's only recently that I have learned to understand and acknowledge the fact that I experience shame very, very readily. It doesn't take much to experience shame.
That's so helpful. Thank you. And what I'm seeing from your sharing of your own experience is that in my experience, the problem wasn't that I was not being productive. It wasn't like I've learned the lesson. Okay, next time I'm not gonna go down the rabbit hole of reading articles or social media or anything, and then I will be able to. The problem was that I was feeling not enough in the first place.
Yes.
And I thought that by filling it with external stuff, hits of completion of a certain task or validation from the outside, or being able to send something off and prove my value to people that are important to me, that I prove my value to.
Yep.
That is where the whole issue started, rather than the lack of productivity.
It's such a good point. It's such a powerful point because in my own recent experience, I have seen how when I'm feeling down, and it's typically because I feel a lack of my own value, which then leads me to experience shame. It may be in different aspects of life. For example, I read something about somebody else on social media and they've gotten all of these likes, right? I have found myself thinking about, well, why didn't I get that kind of attention? Uh, and I think I can actually convey that very idea in a much better way. And I've been doing that for so many years. Mm-hmm. And then I start to think about other things that are going to happen in my life. For example, I'm going to do a workshop tomorrow. And I suddenly feel myself getting excited about that workshop tomorrow. And then I've thought about, well, why am I so excited about that workshop tomorrow? And in prying into it, I realized that the reason why I'm excited is I'm now going to actually perform in tomorrow's workshop to compensate for the lack of my own value that I'm feeling right now as I look at social media. And now suddenly that workshop has become a platform for me to prove to myself that I'm indeed valuable, right? And I've noticed this many times. I also look to coaching sessions to actually reinforce a sense of my own value, which is so, I guess, counterintuitive to how, as a coach, we should actually be stepping into that zone, as to just be a mirror to somebody else. But now in this case, the coaching session becomes a way for me to prove to myself that I'm indeed valuable. Mm-hmm. And in being able to notice that, it has also been, part of me feels like, wow, there's such a there's such an internal mechanism of I need crutches, and I look to all these external things where I'm actually going to perform for me to feel my own sense of value. And the second thing has also been the fact that the awareness of this helps me, I guess, go into a workshop or go into a coaching session with greater preparedness. I have to really pray for these things not to show up, and to grow into those sessions with a pure desire to serve rather than prove to myself that I'm valuable in some way or form.
So I think with these examples, we've outlined kind of the two big problems with shame here. The first is that it makes us just think about us, and we're not out there with other people. It becomes, what does that person think about me, or I'm not enough. And so I feel like this big imposter, and it really keeps us closed, and there's no empathy. We're not really with people. And then the second problem, as you just shared, is our reaction to that feeling. So there's this feeling of deflation and being closed and, kind of wanting to hide and not come out. And because that doesn't feel good, and especially for people who are so used to being energized and empowered and, kicking butt in the world, there's just this massive overreaction. And that can show up as, I'm here as your coach and I'm going to tell you what to do, or it can come out as narcissism, let me tell you how awesome I am, even though inside I don't really feel that awesome. Or it can come out as anger or frustration at people. But whatever it is, there's this overreaction to make us feel so powerful and to get that control back that we've lost when we feel the shame.
Well, this is where the ego is a master at, right? Like, from my own understanding of what shame is, shame is is the ego not being able to live up to the real self. It's and when we put all our stock on who we think we need to be rather than who we are, and who we are being our real self, and who we think we need to be being the ego, right there is a dichotomy. Shame as an emotion, and this is true about so many of these emotions that we experience, like guilt or anger, frustration. They're essentially showing us there is a gap. And shame as an emotion shows us the gap of, deep down, it's trying to draw a distinction between who we are and who we think we need to be. Um, and when we think that we are the ego, it's interesting, right? Who we are and who we think we need to be. Those two things can be very confusing. We think who we need to be is who we are. And who we are as something that we have to grow out of. Right? Suddenly there is a flip in those two identities, and this can be very confusing. And so shame is pointing to a gap, at the gap between those two things. And in my own experience, the ego, who we think we need to be, side of it, can never really live up to who we are. And so what it has to do is it has to manufacture something, which is where we feel the drive towards overcompensation, right? We feel this drive to okay, now I have to do something about it. Whether it's a pep talk, whether it's putting on an image, manufacturing a story that makes us look bigger than who we are. All of those things. It's the ego trying to pump itself up to look like, quote unquote, the real self, when it very clearly knows that it can't, but it's trying to say, you know what, I'm going to show you. and that's what that feeling is. That's what that drive is.
It brings back our last conversation on imposter syndrome, where you had brought up the point that, so much of the self-help today around imposter syndrome is, well, just pump yourself up. And if you can convince yourself that you are better than you are, then that'll be great, because you are that good. And of course, there's a truth to needing to tap into confidence and to have a belief in yourself. But it's also a great way for us to see, where am I trying to be someone that I'm not? And that might be the key to overcoming imposter syndrome, is shame, is rather than pumping ourselves up, is to actually take stock of where we are.
And this goes back to what you were actually talking about right at the start, is how do we learn how to hold shame, right? If we are a culture where as soon as we talk about, this goes back to what you said, we don't talk about these things because there's just so much taboo. We don't even know how to talk about these emotions in a very constructive way. We either say you shouldn't feel it, or we say, well, 10 different ways in which you can never feel it again, or 10 different ways in which you actually 7 different ways in which you can overcome it. But we never talk about, well, how do we hold it? How do we transform it? And transformation will not happen without us knowing why those emotions exist in the first place, and holding them in a very dignified way, because those emotions exist for a reason. They have a purpose, and unless we know what that purpose is, we can never really constructively utilize the suffering that comes from these emotions, right? So going back to your point about the imposter syndrome, we will never really be able to understand and overcome, transform the imposter syndrome, if we don't learn how to talk about why we experience imposter syndrome. And sometimes that phase of imposter syndrome might last for a good while.
Uh-huh.
We many times artificially choose to escape it, but then we go back to it because we experience it again. So how do we learn to navigate these very complex psychological, terrains, some of which we have never really charted before? And what that requires is an acknowledgement of the fact that, well, this is very foreign to me. I don't know what this is about.
Uh-huh.
And the reason why I don't know what this is about is because I don't know what the real self is. Right? Somehow we're supposed to know it. How? It's such a it's such a expectation that socially we experience, but also we have this expectation of ourselves that we are supposed to know our true self.
Mm-hmm.
The fact of the matter is, most of us, and dare I say, 99.99% of us don't know what the true self is, what our true self is. And we are perhaps in a journey, willingly or unwillingly, to find it. Most of us unwillingly. But in the process of finding it, we are somehow proclaiming, perhaps prematurely, that we have found it and others need to find it too. And if others can just follow us, then they will find it too. Mm-hmm. But it just becomes, this whole blind leading the blind kind of journey here. But if we can acknowledge the fact that, well, this is a terrain that I'm in, and this is something that I have to navigate only by learning why this exists, to completely embrace all the emotions that it comes with, and learning to develop honesty and humility in the process, which then eventually the shame transforms into humility. The shame transforms into something that is deep compassion for the self and for the other people around us. That journey of transformation requires for us to learn how to hold these complex emotions like shame, and understand them very deeply.
The word hold is it really conjures up something for me. And that is a slow pace. Because, when we talk about carrying your shame, what I realize is like, okay, I'll carry it and just like sprint ahead with it. And then that'll just be something else I need to overcome. But this word hold, it implies like not going anywhere, or just walking at a really slow pace and experiencing everything that's happening, all that feeling of being de-energized and feeling not enough, and maybe that chest pain or that stuff in the head, that the pain in the head that I was talking about earlier, just being with it and being like, yeah, this is shame and I'm experiencing it and I'm okay to talk about it. When I feel the safe container and I'm with people that are going to hold that container for me and love me because of and in spite of anything, then I just want to share it with them.
Thank you. That's so powerful. As we talk about hold, there are so many conceptions and misconceptions about that holding the emotion picture, right? And to just reflect on what it does not mean, what holding of complex emotions like shame, in the case that we're talking about, does not mean, is wallowing in the shame. It does not mean like, oh my God, look at me, look at what society has done to me. Uh, that is not what holding is. That is just the other side of, we talked about how sometimes shame impels us to just become a hero.
Mhm.
Sometimes shame can just impel us to become a victim, right? And somehow the idea behind it is this narcissistic pull towards myself, whether I'm a victim or a hero, right? And if neither of those two strategies work, then the third strategy is the villain, where now I'm going to, this gets really dark. Now I'm going to make other people experience that emotion that I experience, shame, right? So that is not holding. None of that is holding. That is, all of that is some form of unhealthy reaction to the emotion of shame. Real holding of shame looks, it feels very grounded. I'm not saying it's comfortable. In fact, when we do step into the bathtub of shame, it doesn't feel comfortable at all. But what comes out of it, what holding looks like, is the capacity to tolerate uh, and not overcompensate for it.
Mm. I so appreciate that point around the hero, the victim, and the villain. And I think the villain has a potential to get really dark, and it also can be our everyday experience. And I'm just thinking about how I have been a villain to my wife, for example, when she'll criticize even a small thing like some dirt on the floor or the fact that I didn't wash my hands. My first reaction is often to like just let her know how she's done wrong. And
So true, right?
that reaction is from a feeling of like, I was already feeling not enough. By your simple calling me out, which is not meant to call me out as a person, it's just meant to call out my behavior and hopefully correct it.
Right.
I take it so personally. And so now let me do this back to you. So now I'll point out all the ways that you're flawed or behaviors that you've done and try to make you feel the same shame that I am.
So true, right? And that's the psychology of the villain. It's essentially, I'm hurt, and so now I will make you feel the same way that I feel. It's funny, how when you watch movies, and the villains that you can actually in some ways, you don't hate them, you understand the complexity of their life, is when you understand what their suffering is and how, as a result of their suffering, have they become so twisted and want to hurt other people, right? You really understand. You actually can feel sorry for them, and it's not too far from our own lives. When we hurt, and when somebody else criticizes us, uh, we feel like they are the cause of our shame, that they are making us feel ashamed of ourselves. So now, just unwittingly, being triggered, our reaction is, so I'm going to make you feel the same hurt that I'm feeling, so that then we can be in it together. It's weird, right? And that just happens. Again, that is not holding the emotion. And holding the emotion in that scenario will look like being able to say, when you criticize me, I feel more ashamed of myself. And it's very hard. And my reaction, my wanting to what I want to do is, I want to actually make you feel the same way, and I feel really terrible about that too. But what I need here is help. I need help. I need you to understand that this is what I'm experiencing, and I need you to be a little kind towards me, because I already don't feel enough, and when you criticize me, I that whole thing about me not feeling enough is just amplified in a very big way, and I need you to go gentle on me, and I really need the help. That's an example of how we can hold. It takes for us to really understand emotion. It takes for us to name it. It takes for us to own it. And it takes for us to be able to express it in a way that really helps somebody else understand what our experience is. Now, it's not a comfortable experience at all, but it's very constructive and transformative.
For all the tough guys out there, that means using words like disappointed and sad and lonely, and talking about how, and I would totally count myself as one of those, or pretending to be tough guys, needing to say, my heart just wasn't received how I wanted it to be received, and that hurt. And not needing to fix it beyond that, but just simply being able to share that.
It's also the whole notion of being tough can be such an overcompensation for actually inside feeling so vulnerable. It usually is, right? And I think real strength comes from, again, the holding, right? When you go to a gym and you really look at someone who has developed the muscular strength, you see that they have to, in the weight training, you actually have to hold the weight. You have to actually like hold it against gravity, which is what really builds the muscle. Right? It doesn't happen without that. Now, it's the same thing for the emotional strength too, emotional, quote unquote, if you would want to call it toughness, or rather call it emotional depth and strength. It only comes by learning how to hold these emotions against what would be a normal way of reacting to them. And learning to talk about them differently. And this can start in small ways. It doesn't have to be, so dramatic. And it is not so dramatic when we learn how to talk about them constructively. It can be emotional because these emotions, we call them emotions for a reason. They are emotional, naturally emotional. We might find ourselves tearing up. But that's all right, because that's just reconnecting with our heart. That's all it is. It's oh my God, this is so dramatic. This person had tears in there. That's dramatic, can look very different. But reconnecting with our hearts is a sense of aliveness. And when that happens in a very grounded way, it's very powerful. We actually suddenly start to feel alive, not just behave as though we are alive, but truly be dead internally. We actually start to feel alive. The heart actually starts to beat.
Yeah, we have access to creativity because we're not so me focused anymore. We're actually out there with the other person and experiencing the world. Yeah. And yet we have access to empathy. We actually have access to giving a crap about this other person who's across the way from us, instead of just wondering what they might be thinking about us or how we're coming off. Where, no, I deeply care about you and I'm here for you.
Yeah, and then that also extends to other parts of our life, whether we are at work, where we can actually show up with more authenticity, really, more genuinity, rather than trying to prove something. And in the process of us being authentic, we do start to create more safe environments for other people to be their true selves at work. and also create cultures where, failing is all right. Where when someone fails, they can actually talk about how they're feeling so ashamed of their own worth.
Mhm.
And to be able to then truly help them grow as human beings.
We can
Um,
give feedback on the level of the behavior rather than the person. It's not about the person. It's just, if we want to fix something, let's just fix what happened, but we don't need to make it
yeah,
about any, there's not a
yeah,
bigger story to it.
yeah. And we can we can step back and really look at, well, what happened, and how can we actually make it even better? As you said, not make it about the person. So all of these things can only happen when we learn how to work with these emotions that we ourselves experience in a very healthy way. Right.
Amazing. Anything else that you would want to share before we close?
The only thing that I would say is, walking through the emotion of shame specifically is never an easy thing. So even as we talk about it, I want to emphasize the point that we're not saying, oh, it's a cakewalk. That's not what this is about at all. What we are actually saying is that the emotion exists for a reason. And it's important to understand why that is the case. And we will not be able to understand that if we just overcompensate for it by either pumping ourselves up, trying to look at overcompensating for it in different ways, running away from it, distracting ourselves with other things. None of that will really help constructively work with the emotion. The only way that we can work with emotion is learning how to hold, look at it, speak about it. And this journey will require us to have somebody in our lives who can walk with us on this journey, who has perhaps walked this before. Because as I said, going into these places is uncharted territory. But when we go there with someone who has walked it before, there is a way in which we will learn how to walk by learning from the other person. So I would say, just like again, the example of being in a gym, when we are lifting weights, we will need someone as a spotter. Even in the daily course of life, having someone in our life who has perhaps walked these emotions and can help us walk them is the biggest gift that we can have. And so I would say, if there is someone like that in our life, really like spend time with that person. And you will see that your life will be tremendously transformed.
Well, you've given me a little bit of a layup, so I'm going to take it. But I'm going to close by saying thank you for being my spotter. And I know you would not declare yourself as somebody who has already walked this path, but I can very much see that you are walking the path, and it's incredible to be a part of that journey, and also for you to be supporting me during mine.